Namo Ramana, and a very, very warm welcome to all the devotees for the first satsang of 2021. We have Mr. Michael James with us. Without taking any more time, I would request Mr. James to please commence the satsang. Sir.
Namaskaram. During our meeting last month, I gave an overview of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, focusing particularly on how Bhagavan repeatedly emphasizes that the root of all problems, the root of the whole appearance of multiplicity, is only ourself as ego. So this month I will focus more deeply. So what I'll focus more deeply on today is the question: what is the solution to this root problem? In other words, how are we to eradicate ego and just be as we actually are? I did touch upon this last time because the same verses in which Bhagavan emphasizes that ego is the root problem, he also emphasizes what it means to get rid of ego. But this is the most important aspect. That is, having identified the disease, what is the cure? What is the remedy for this disease? That is what Bhagavan makes very, very clear in Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu. So that's what's so important about this text. It's such a practical text. In the very first verse, the very first mangalam verse, Bhagavan talks about, that is talked about what is the practice, what is the solution, but he explains it in a very high level way, but he explains, but he elucidates in later verses. But what he says in the first mangalam verses, actually when he first composed this verse, it was a veṇbā. That is just a two-line veṇbā. So I'll first discuss the veṇbā, and then I'll discuss how he elaborated on it. That is, in its original form, the mangalam verse was simply Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, Uḻḷate, Uḻḷapadi, Uḻḷade, Uļḷadu. That means who, that is, sorry, it can mean who, but also how to think of the existing substance, which is no, not even which is called heart. That was added later. So how to think of the existing substance, the Uḻḷadu, that means the sat vastu. So how are we to think of that? And then the answer he gave is Uḻḷate, Uļḷapadi, Uļḷade. Being in the heart as it is, Ullal is thinking of it or meditating on it. Know that. This is a very aphoristic way of saying it. When Bhagavan composed Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, it first consisted of 42 verses plus this one veṇbā as a mangalam verse. Before it went to print, it was seen by Kavyaganta Ganpati Sastri. He knew Tamil to some extent, but he didn't have a very good knowledge. He didn't have a very deep knowledge of Tamil because his mother tongue was Telugu and the language in which he specialized was Sanskrit. So when he was told about Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, he wanted to have a look at it. And the first thing he said is, why is all the other verses are 4 lines? Why is this the mangalam verse only 2 lines? So Bhagavan said, okay, I'll make it 4 lines. So he added the first 2 lines. And then the next comment of Ganpati Muni is, how can this be an appropriate mangalam verse? There's no mention of God in it. That is, there's no mention of a personal God. So he then looked through the work, and he found later on towards the end, I can't remember exactly where it was located, he noticed a verse in which Bhagavan referred to Maheshwar. So he said, this is a more appropriate verse. So he said this would be an appropriate verse to have as a mangalam verse. Then Bhagavan and Murugan discussed it among themselves. Then they thought, yes, the first mangalam, the existing mangalam verse is pointing to the path of self-investigation. And the second, and if we take, so we can take this as a second verse, as a second mangalam verse, because it's dealing with surrender. So Bhagavan often said there are two ways, though he also said these two ways are actually one. So the self-investigation and self-surrender. So it's fitting to have two mangalam verses. So they took that as the mangalam verse, and then Bhagavan composed one other verse. I can't remember now which verse it was. But it was, I got a note somewhere. But anyway, he composed another verse later on. So that brought the whole total up to 42 verses, all are veṇbās, that's 4-line verses. So when he made this first verse into a veṇbā, from a Kuril veṇbā from a 2-line veṇbā into a 4-line veṇbā, what he added the first 2 lines. So the whole verse then became Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, Uḻḷadu Uḷḷadu Upadēśa Kaliveṇbā, Uḻḷadu Uļļadu Nāṛpadu, Uļļadu Nāṛpadu. So it's a very, very beautiful verse, and most of the words are based on the root ul. Ul has 2 meanings. That is the basic meaning of ul is it's the root of a verb meaning to be or to exist. It also is the root of another verb meaning to think. So in some of the words have 2 meanings. So the first sentence is Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu Sorry, now I read it wrongly. Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu. That is, this can be interpreted in several ways. The basic meaning, or the primary meaning is Uڵḷadu. If Uڵḷadu were not, Uڵḷadu, would there be Uڵļadu? Uڵļadu means what is or what exists. It implies what actually exists. And Uڵļadu means, literally it means the existing awareness. It can also be taken to the existing awareness or actual awareness. It can also imply awareness of what exists. So in this first sentence, the first interpretation of this first sentence is if what exists did not exist, would there be awareness of what exists? So in other words, the very fact that we are aware of something existing shows that there is something that exists. So what is that something? That is, Bhagavan explains in the next sentence. But this sentence can also be interpreted in 2 other ways. The first other way is, except as Uڵḷadu, does Uļļadu exist? That is, what that implies is that the awareness of existence is nothing but existence itself. This is what Bhagavan explained in more detail in verse 23 of Upadēśa Undiyār. What he says in verse 23 of Upadēśa Undiyār is Uļļadu Nāṛpadu Unavei verin Uļļadu Unavahum Undipara Unavei namai ullam undipara. What that means is Uļļadu Nāṛpadu Unavei verin since there is no to know what is, since there is no other awareness, Uļļadu itself is Uṇavū. That is, what exists is itself is awareness. What that means is, that is, if there couldn't be an awareness other than what exists, because if it were other than what exists, it wouldn't exist. So Bhagavan said, because of the non-existence of any awareness other than what exists, to know what exists itself is awareness. That is, the fundamental reality is only awareness. Awareness here means the pure awareness I am. What in Sanskrit is called chit. That is basically what Bhagavan is giving a very simple argument here to establish the oneness of Sat and Chit. That is, if Chit was something other than Sat, it wouldn't exist, and so it couldn't know Sat. So Sat itself must be Chit. That is, we cannot be that. What actually exists is only awareness. And awareness and what exists are not two different things. And then in the final sentence of this verse, what is that Uṇļļadu? What is that Uḻḷadu? What is that one awareness that actually exists? He says, Uṇavei nāmai ullam. That is, existence alone exists as we. What we actually are is only existence. And the way that's a very subtle way he expressed this sentence. That is, the verb ullam is a second person plural form of the verb ul, to exist. So it means we exist. But the subject is Uṇļļadu. So to emphasize that Uṇļļadu is nothing other than ourselves, the verb, he puts the verb that is, the subject is Uṇļļadu, but the verb is in second person plural. The reason he uses second person here is, of course, we are only one. There is only one, but he uses the term we as an inclusive form of the first person pronoun I, the first person singular pronoun. Why he uses this plural form? Because if he says I, that would be excluding us, but he's including us. So he uses the word we. So we are, the awareness is nothing but we, and he emphasizes it very, very strongly. So this verse helps us to understand, because he composed Upadēśa Undiyār before Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. So this verse helps us to understand the second meaning of this sentence, which is perfectly in line with that both meanings are equally appropriate. If there weren't something that exists, there couldn't be awareness of something that exists, or there couldn't be, no awareness could exist at all. So, but it also means that awareness of what exists cannot be other than what exists. So that's the second meaning of this first sentence of first mangalam verse of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. There's also a third meaning, because ulla can mean what exists. It can be that is an relative pronoun or an adjectival, a relative participle or an adjectival participle, meaning that exists. It can also mean to think, because ullal is a verb that means to think. So another interpretation of this first sentence is, other than ullļļadu, is there an awareness to think of it? So in order to, that it can be awareness, but thinks of ullļļadu be other than ullļļadu. So that's a third meaning of his sentence. Then in the second sentence, he says, that is, what is this ullļļadu? What is this ullļļadu? In the second sentence, he refers to it as ulla-porul. Porul is a Tamil word that means the same as vastu in Sanskrit. In other words, it means substance. So ulla-porul is the existing substance. In other words, it refers to the same thing, but the term ullļļadu exists. That is, what actually exists is only the substance. That is, when we see, for example, an analogy Bhagavan used in verse 13 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu is the analogy of gold and ornaments. What actually exists there is only gold. Gold may take different forms. It may appear as a ring. It may appear as a necklace. It may appear as a bangle. But the substance is only gold. So what is real is only the gold, because the same gold you can melt and make the ring into you can melt several rings together and make them into a bangle or into a necklace. So the forms are just a temporary appearance. They're not real. What is real is only the substance. That's an analogy. But here, Bhagavan is referring to what actually exists. That is the substance. Now we see all these forms. What is the substance of all these forms? It is only existence. What actually exists, that is the substance. And that is awareness. So awareness alone is the substance of all of all that appears to be, of all forms. But forms are not real. What's real is only the awareness. So he used, as I say, he uses this term Uḻḷadu, and he says Uḻḷadu Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu. That means since the existing substance exists in the heart without thought, Ullamenum Ullapodul Ullaleban. So how to think of the existing substance, which is called heart. Ullamenum Ullapodul means the existing substance which is called heart. So though he says it exists in the heart, actually it is the heart. There's no, that is, what is in the heart is only the heart. They're not two, it's not one thing existing inside another thing. There's only one thing, that Ullapodul, but exists in the heart. That means it's ever shining, that implies it's ever shining in our heart as I am. It is, the heart is nothing but I am. That is, I am is shining in the heart, but there's no heart other than I am. So Ullamenum means what, which is called heart. Ullam also, as I said, it's also the second person plural form, first person plural form of the verb ul. So it means we are, or in other words, it implies I am. So another meaning for ullamenum, that ullapodul is called heart, and it's also called I am. So that's another meaning. There's so much meaning Bhagavan has packed in here. So what is the significance of this question? As I say, when Bhagavan originally composed the verse, he simply put the question, Ullapodul Ullaleban, how to think of the existing substance. But here he's explaining it. Since that existing substance exists in the heart and is called the heart, and it is what is called the heart, and it exists ullallada, without thinking or without thought. So that is what the reality transcends all thought. So how can we think of that which transcends thought? That is the question he puts here, and then the answer he gives is ullate ullapadi ullade ullal. That is being in the heart as it is alone is contemplating it or meditating on it. That is, in order to know it or to meditate on it, we just have to be it. As he says in verse 26 of Upadēśa Undiyār, he says very nicely, Tanai iritale, tanai aridalam. Being oneself alone is knowing oneself. Tani rendatradal, because oneself is not two. If there were two things, if there were two selves, then one self knows the other self, but there's only one self. So how to know ourselves? Only by being ourselves. Why? Because what we actually are, as he said in verse 23 of Upadēśa Undiyār, we are nothing but awareness. So how is awareness to know itself? It just has to be itself. Just by being aware, being awareness, we are knowing awareness. So just merely being ourselves is knowing ourselves. So in this verse 20, in this first mangalam verse, he says the only way to meditate on it, implying the only way to know it, is to be it, be as it is. What does being as it is mean? Ullapadi? It is, how is it? It is without thought. It is this as awareness without thought. So just to be thought-free awareness is meditating on it. Many of you may not be familiar with Tamil, but you may know Sanskrit. It is very well known that Bhagavan has composed 38 verses in Sanskrit. That is the 5 verses of Aruṇācala Pancharatnam, the 30 verses of Upadēśa Saram, and the 3 verses of Muktakatrayam, the 3 miscellaneous verses. That is Hridaya Guhara Madhye, Deham Rinmaya, and Ekamaksharam. These 38 verses are very well known. What is not very well known is that Bhagavan also composed this first mangalam verse of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu in Sanskrit, in a Sanskrit veṇbā. How that came about is, when Lakshman Sharma first came to Bhagavan, soon after he had come, Bhagavan asked him one day, have you read Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu? And Lakshmana Sharma said, I've heard of it, but I haven't tried to read it because I'm not, that is, though he was a Tamilian, he hadn't studied literary Tamil, because at school, in those days, under the British rule, they were given this was all part of a divide and rule policy. They gave them a choice. They had to study English and either Sanskrit or their mother tongue. So most Brahmins tended to opt for Sanskrit. So often, previous to that British education policy brought in by Macaulay, any educated person would know both that in Tamil Nadu or in any part of India, they both know both their mother tongue and Sanskrit. That is, in Tamil Nadu, any educated person, whether Brahmin or non-Brahmin, if they were educated, they would study both Tamil and Sanskrit. And they would be able to understand both Sanskrit literature and Tamil literature. But after this Macaulay policy, Brahmins generally opted to study Sanskrit as the second language, and non-Brahmins generally opted to study Tamil. Which was a very unfortunate, had the unfortunate effect that many people like Lakshmana Sharma, a well-educated person, though he was Tamil was his mother tongue, he had difficulty understanding literary Tamil. So anyway, so he said, Bhagavan, I'm not so conversant with Tamil, literary Tamil, but he thought to himself, this is a very good opportunity, since Bhagavan himself has asked me, let me ask Bhagavan to explain to. So he said, but I would like to study it if Bhagavan would be kind to explain it to me. And Bhagavan said, certainly, yes. So Bhagavan started to explain to him the verses. And since Lakshmana Sharma had a love for Sanskrit, and he was a moderately competent poet in Sanskrit, he said to Bhagavan, while you're explaining to me, I would like, first he asked Bhagavan to translate it into Sanskrit. And Bhagavan said, no, you know Sanskrit better than I do, you can translate it. But then Lakshmana Sharma said, but you have told me about the greatness of the veṇbā meter, and you said that even Kavyaganta couldn't compose any verses in veṇbā. So why don't you compose Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu in Sanskrit in veṇbā meter? And then Bhagavan said, no, you compose it. You try. I mean, he said, how can I try? How can I do it? Even Kavyaganta couldn't compose. Only Bhagavan can compose veṇbās in Sanskrit. But Bhagavan said, no, you try. So Lakshmana Sharma struggled and wasn't able to compose a veṇbā in Sanskrit. Then he asked Bhagavan, please show me how it can be done. Then Bhagavan composed this verse this veṇbā in Sanskrit, which is a translation of this first mangalam verse. Unfortunately, this isn't so well known, but it's a very important verse that Bhagavan has composed, because it's firstly, it's the only Sanskrit veṇbā. I mean, that's interesting from a literary point of view, but from a spiritual point of view, this first and most important verse of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, Bhagavan himself has composed in Sanskrit. So what Bhagavan, Sanskrit veṇbā is, sadvina sadjnanam asti kimu satyam vriti rahitam hridi vibhati ataha tatridayam jayati katam hridita atma-bhava stiti jnanam satvastu nasyat. What that means is, the first sentence is, sadvina sadjnanam astu kimu. That means, without sat, could satjnanam exist? In other words, without existence, could there be awareness of existence? Obviously, that's a rhetorical question. The implication is satjnana is nothing, couldn't exist without sat, and it's nothing other than sat. Then the second sentence is, satyam vritti rahitam hridi vibhati. The reality shines in the heart, free of thoughts. And then the third sentence is, atas tat hridayam jayati katam. Therefore, how to meditate on it by heart. That is, Bhagavan is saying that satyam, that sat is itself the heart. And then he answers that by saying, Shridi tatatma bhava stiti dhyanam satvastunaha. That means standing or abiding or remaining in the heart as it is. That is, tatatma bhava means as it is. That implies as thought-free being, is contemplation on Satvastu. So what is it to meditate on Satvastu? What he refers to in Tamil as Uḻḷadu, he refers to here as Satvastu, an exact translation. So in order to meditate on that Satvastu, we just have to be as it is in the heart. And then the final word is Syat, which means may you be. So may you be as it is, that implies. So this is a very, very precise and accurate translation in Sanskrit, in veṇbā meter, of this first mangalam verse. So this is, as I say, this is a very important verse, and it's unfortunate, but it's not more well known. So this is the first mangalam verse. So what Bhagavan says is that being as it is meditating on it. So how to be as it is? What prevents us being as it is, that is what stands between us and that reality, is thought. And as he explained in verse 18 of Upadēśa Undiyār, mind is a collective name for thoughts, but of all thoughts, the root of all thoughts, the first of all thoughts, is the thought called I, that is ego. So long as we rise as ego, that whenever we rise as ego, as Bhagavan says in verse 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, ego comes into existence grasping form. It stands grasping form. And it grasping and feeding on form, it flourishes. So all forms of thoughts, and all thoughts are forms. So what he refers to there as a form, we can equally refer to. So the root of all thoughts is only the first thought, I. Why is it the root of all thoughts? Because all other thoughts are jada. They are not aware of their own existence. The only thought that is endowed with awareness, not pure awareness, it's what is called chittabhasa, the reflection of awareness, is this first thought, I. So it's only in the form, in the view of ourselves as ego, this first thought, I, but all other thoughts exist. So no other thought could exist without this first thought, I. So in order to be without thoughts, we need to be without ego. In other words, we need to refrain from rising as ego. When we don't rise as ego, then we are being in the heart as it is. So what he implies in this verse, when he talks of being in the heart as it is, means not rising as ego. So how to avoid rising as ego? In the next mangalam verse, Bhagavan says we have to surrender this ego. That is, indirectly, that's what he implies. What he says in the second mangalam verse is marana baya mikku ammakal marana baya mikku ammakal arunaha marana baba ila mahesan saraname saba. That is, those who those ammakal means it literally means beautiful people, but it implies beautiful. The beauty is the beauty of purity of heart. So those pure-hearted or those mature souls who have intense fear of death, what do? They take refuge at the feet of Mahesan, who they take refuge as their fortress, as their place of refuge. Aran means a fortress. So if you're inside a fortress, you're safe. So they take refuge as their fortress at the feet of Marana Baba Mila Mahesan. That is Mahesan, who the Supreme Lord, who is devoid of birth and death. So if we have this fear of death, so long as we rise as ego, we experience ourselves as a body, and this body is surely going to die. So the fear of death is always there in the background. We may not dwell on that, but we all fear death. But because of our attachment to this manifold existence, our mind is always going outwards, and we're forgetting about our own mortality. But if we are sufficiently mature, that intense fear of death will come. And when that intense fear of death will come, where is the refuge? Only by clinging to the feet of the birthless and deathless Mahesan. And then in the next sentence, he says, Tam sarvodu, tam sarvu utra, by their taking refuge. In other words, by their surrender. So taking refuge means surrender, surrendering to the feet of Mahesa. So by their surrender, they attain death. They die as a result of their surrender. That, in other words, when ego surrenders, it dies. And having died, will they bear? In the last sentence, he says, "Savu enum sarvaro sarvadava." That is, having died, they become deathless. So will those who are deathless be associated again with the thought of death? That is, having died as ego, we will no longer identify ourselves as a body, so we'll no longer have any thought of death. To understand what he means here by taking refuge at the feet of Mahesan, that means surrendering to the feet of Mahesan. What does he mean by surrendering? This is what he explains very clearly in the first sentence of the first sentence of the 13th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār. Here he defines what is it to give ourselves to God. In other words, in order to take refuge at the feet of God, we have to be ready to give ourselves to him. We have to entrust ourselves entirely to his care. So how do we give ourselves to God? He explains in this sentence, Anmachintane Tavira, Vera Chintane Kalambavadaku, Satram Idam Kodamal, Atmanishta Paranai Iripade, Tane Isanaku Alipadam. Atmanishta Paranai Iripade means being as Atmanishta Paran, one who is firmly established as oneself. So being firmly established as oneself is giving ourself to God. So ourself here means our real nature. So to be firmly established as our real nature, in other words, to be in the heart as it is, that is giving ourselves to God. But how do we remain established as Atmanishta Paran? How do we remain in the heart as it is? That is what he explains in the first clause. Anmachintane Tavira. That is, accept the Atmachintana. Atmachintana means thought of oneself, or in other words, self-attentiveness. Atmachintane Tavira, Vera Chintane Kalambavadaku, Satram Idam Kodamal. Not giving even the slightest room to the rising of any thought other than the thought of oneself. In other words, being so keenly self-attentive, but we give no room to the rising of any other thought, that is being in the heart as it is. That is being Atmanishta Paran, and that is giving ourselves to God. So this sentence of Nāṉ Ār, he ties together the meaning of these two mangalam verses. How to be in the heart as it is, we must surrender. How to surrender, we must be so keenly self-attentive, but we give no room to the rising of any other thought. Then only we can be in the heart as it is. So all these Bhagavan's teachings are so beautifully interconnected. Every teaching of his is connected to every other teaching. So the connection between these things is so beautiful and so important. So I've spent a long time talking about these verses. Now, so the point is, now we have to remain without rising as ego. So only when we when we give no room to rising of any other thoughts, that it includes, we have to cling firmly to self-attentiveness. And by clinging to self-attentiveness, we thereby prevent the rising of ego. So the verses in which Bhagavan deals with this in most detail are really the core verses of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. So I will now jump to these core verses. That is this is really from verse 30, verse 23 to verse 30. I mean, other verses are very important, but these are the core verses where he's talking about ego and how to get rid of ego. Though of course, he's touching on that subject throughout Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, but these are the very heart of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. What he says in verse 23 is, Nāṉ Ār ideham naviladu. This body, body does not say I. Here, when he says say, he's using it in a metaphorical sense. When he said the body does not say I, the body is not aware of itself as I, is the implication. So this body is not aware of itself as I. So this body cannot be what we actually are, because we are aware of ourselves as I, but this body is not aware of itself as I. So we cannot be the body. That's one reason why the body cannot be what we actually are. Another reason why the body cannot be actually are, in sleep, there's no body. We're not aware of the body. But as he says, Urukatum Nāṉ Ārum Nāṛpadu Illai. No one says, in sleep I didn't exist. In sleep, we were not aware of the body, we were not aware of the world, we were not aware of anything. But we were aware of our own existence. We clearly know in sleep, yes, I slept. So what is that I but slept in sleep? But was asleep? That we must exist in order to sleep. So we are aware of our own existence in sleep. So the body is not aware of itself as I, and we are aware of ourselves as I, even in the absence of body in sleep. So this is an argument why we cannot be, this body cannot be what we actually are. However, we all know that now we're aware of ourselves as I am this body. So this awareness, I am this body, is not a real awareness of ourselves. The real awareness of ourselves is only the fundamental awareness I am. We are aware I am, but we're not aware just I am now. When we rise as ego, we're aware of ourselves as I am, but not just as I am. We're aware of ourselves as I am this body. So this is what he refers to in the next sentence, the third sentence, as Nāṉ Ār, one thing called I. Nāṉ Ār eradication. When one thing called I, after one thing called I rises, everything rises. So only when we rise as this ego, this false awareness, I am this body, do all other things come into existence. All other things are forms. How do we see forms? As Bhagavan said in verse 5 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, verse 4 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, Uruvam Tānayin Ulu Paramatran. If oneself is a form, the world and God will be likewise. If oneself is not a form, who can see their forms and how? It's only when we take ourselves to be the form of a body that we're aware of other forms. So only when we rise as this ego, the false awareness I am this body, does everything else come into existence. So without ego, nothing else exists is the implication. Therefore, what should we do? That is the fourth sentence he says, in the Nāṉ Ār nunmatial en. En literally means think, but here it's used in the sense of investigate. Investigate with a nunmati. Nunmati means a subtle mind or subtle intellect. That means a subtle power of discernment, subtle power to distinguish. Now, what is the problem? Now we are, this awareness I am is mixed up with awareness of the body as a form of conflated awareness, I am this body. Now we need to distinguish the I am from this I am the body. So we need a very subtle power of discernment. That's what nun matial means. We need a very subtle and fine power of discernment in order to investigate and find out what this I actually is. So this in the Nāṉ Ār, where does this I rise? Okay, we rise as ego in waking dream. From where do we rise? Where were we in sleep? In sleep, we were just abiding as we are in our own real nature. We rise as ego in waking and dream. From where do we rise? We rise only from our real nature. From where else could we rise? Everything else comes into existence only after we rise as ego. So we cannot rise from anything other than ourselves. We can only rise from ourselves, from our own real nature. So the place from which we rise is our own real nature. That is the pure awareness I am. So when he says we need to investigate with a subtle mind, where this I rises means we have to investigate this fundamental awareness I am. What happens if we investigate this fundamental awareness I am? He answers that in the Kaliveṇbā version of this verse. In the Kaliveṇbā, whereas in the Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu itself, in the Veṇbā form of the verse, this sentence ends with an imperative, N, investigate. But in the Kaliveṇbā version, he extended this as Enna Naravum. That means Enna means when we investigate. So when we investigate with a keen mind, or when one investigates with a keen mind or a subtle mind, where this I rises, Naravum, it will slip off. It will depart. It slips away. So this is the key revelation of Bhagavan, that we seem to be ego only when we're attending to other things. When we're looking at forms, we seem to be ego, because only when we're aware of ourselves as a form can we see other forms. So long as we're looking at forms, so long as we're grasping forms, so long as we're attending to anything other than ourselves, we seem to be ego. But if we try to investigate ourselves, or the place where this I rises, in other words, the fundamental awareness I am, this ego will disappear, because without thoughts to hold on to, without grasping form, it cannot come into existence, it cannot stand. When we try to grasp I am is not a form. It is the pure awareness, the pure formless awareness of our own existence. So when we try to grasp that I am, ego will dissolve and disappear. That's what he says again in verse 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, Tedinal otum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. So this is the key revelation of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. And this he emphasizes in many, many verses when he says, but for example, in verse 9, he says, the dyads and triads, that the pairs of opposites and the three factors of objective knowledge, the knower, the knowing, and the known, these exist depending on or holding on to one thing. That one thing, implication is ego. And if we investigate what that one thing is, they disappear. And then in verses 10 and 11 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, he talks about knowledge and ignorance. To whom of this knowledge and ignorance? He says in verse 11, if we investigate to whom of this knowledge and ignorance will cease. Why? Because the ego who has that knowledge and ignorance will cease. In verse 14 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, he says the same thing. That is, second and third persons, so long as there's a first person, that means ego, second and third persons will be there. But if one investigates the truth of the truth of the first person, the second and third persons will come to an end, and the first person will cease to exist, and second and third persons will also come to an end. So in all these verses, he's saying by investigating ego, we free ourselves from all other things. Verse 19, he says the same thing. Fate and will, they exist for whom? They exist only for ego. So if we investigate the root of fate and will, the base of fate and will will both cease to exist. Why? Because the ego will cease to exist. So that implication is there in all these verses. In verse 38 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, he says the same thing. Vine mudal namayin, vile payan tripo. If we are the doer of actions, we will have to experience the resulting fruit. But if we know ourselves by investigating who is the doer of actions, the doership will depart and all the three karmas will come to an end. So everything is depending only on ego. The doership is nothing but ego. That is, as ego, we are aware of ourselves as I am this body and mind, there's 5 sheaves. So whatever actions are done by body, speech, or mind, because we experience this body, speech, or mind as I, we experience them as I am doing this. So what is called doership is nothing but ego. If we investigate who is the doer, in other words, who am I, this ego will thereby dissolve, doership will depart, and all 3 karmas will go. Likewise, in verse 39, he says, Only so long as we take ourselves to be I am bound, are there thoughts of bondage and liberation. But if we know ourselves, to investigate ourselves and know what we actually are, I'll just find the verse. Only so long as one is aware of oneself as I am bound, thoughts of bondage and liberation exist. When one looks at oneself to see who is, or to, one looks at oneself to see who is the one who is bound, oneself thereby, what we actually are, then alone remains as what is eternally liberated. So the thoughts of bondage and liberation will no longer occur. So in other words, bondage and liberation exist only so long as we rise as ego. If we investigate this ego, bondage and liberation both come to an end. So in all these verses, Bhagavan is emphasizing this unique revelation that he has given to the world. But the nature of ego is such, but it seems to exist so long as it's grasping form. In other words, so long as it's attending to anything other than itself. When it tries to attend to itself or to investigate the place from which it rose, in other words, the pure awareness I am, it will cease to exist. Then in verse 24, he doesn't actually mention the self-investigation, but he again defines what is ego. Jada Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu, in sentient body doesn't say I. Satchit Uḍiyādu, the Satchit, the Uḷḷadu, the existing awareness, the real awareness doesn't rise. Or the awareness of existence, that is the Satchit, doesn't rise. But between this body which isn't aware of itself as I and this Satchit which doesn't rise, something, Uḍڵļadu, to the extent of a body, Nāṉ Ār, one thing called I, Udikum, rises, ideal, between these two. So something arises, something that is neither this Jada body, which isn't aware of itself as I, nor is it Satchit, because Satchit doesn't rise, but some spurious awareness rises as the extent of a body. That is the false awareness, I am this body, that is ego. That is what he refers to here as Nāṉ Ār, one thing called I. It rises ideal between these two. Why does he say between? Because it's neither a body nor is it Satchit. Because the body is not aware of itself as I, and Satchit doesn't rise. So it's not either of these. But that is the nature of ego is abhimanam. Abhimanam means attachment or appropriation. We can say misappropriation. That is the nature of ego is misappropriation. It misappropriates the body as I, and it misappropriates the awareness I am as itself. That is, it is neither the body nor is it the pure awareness I am, but it misappropriates both, joins them together, and says I am this body. So this misappropriating ego, this abhimanam, this dehabhimanam, that is ego. What is this? Idu chit jada granti. It is the knot that binds chit and jada. That is, chit and jada are two. That is, chit is pure awareness, is never aware of any jada things. But as ego, we take ourselves to be awareness, and we're aware of all these jada things. So we have a chit jada granti. That is the I am portion of I am this body is chit. The body portion is jada. These two are combined as if they were one. So this is the knot that binds chit and jada. Of course, chit is never bound, but in the view of ego, we seem to be bound to this body. We seem to be tied to this body. So this is chit jada granti. It is bandham, because we bound ourselves. Once we've tied ourselves to this body, we're bound. It's jivan. What is called jiva is nothing but this. It is nupame, the subtle body. Here Bhagavan is giving a very different meaning to the term subtle body, to the term sense in which it's usually used in Advaitic texts. Here he's not saying that usually the term subtle body is used to refer to 3 of the 5 sheaths, the pranamaya kosha, manomaya kosha, and vijnanamaya kosha. They're generally called the subtle body. But here Bhagavan is saying, no, all the 5 sheaths are gross. The subtle body is the ego that takes these 5 sheaths as I. So even according to Bhagavan, even the karana sarira, the anandamaya kosha, the will, that is also gross. What is the subtle body is only this ego, this jiva. It is subtle body. It is ahande, that is ego. It's samsara. It is samsara. Why is it samsara? Because all this entire samsara, what is the seed of samsara? It's only ego. See, the whole of samsara is nothing but an expansion of ego. It is samsara. It is manam, mind. So here he's defining what is ego, and then in verse 25 he describes the nature of ego. What is the nature of ego and how to get rid of ego? And everything is packed in verse 25. This is the most important verse of all. This and 26 together form a very heart of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. And they explain that first mangalam verse, which is the essence of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. So they're all closely interlinked. That is, in the last line of verse 25 is the subject, Uruvatra Payahande. That is, he describes the ego, ahande, as Uruvatra. It's devoid of form, it's formless. And he also describes it as a pay. Pay means a phantom. Why does he call it formless? Because it has no form of its own. But ego is that spurious entity that rises between the jada body and the jadodal and satchit. So it is not this body. It's got no form of its own. So it's formless. It's also a phantom because it's got no substance of its own. Just like it appropriates the form of the body, it appropriates the substance of satchit. In other words, it takes itself to be awareness. So it is neither the body nor satchit. So it's actually a formless phantom. But it appropriates both of these as its own. It's a misappropriation, an abhimanam. That's why often in older texts, ego is defined as abhimanam. So this is the root problem, is this misappropriation. This is the nature of ego. So Bhagavan says, so that is what the subject is. But Bhagavan doesn't begin with the subject. The subject comes at the end. What he says is, referring to this formless phantom called ego, he says, Urupatri undam, grasping form, it comes into existence. That's only by taking by attaching ourselves to the form of a body and taking that body to be I, misappropriating that body as I, it comes into existence. So the first form the ego grasps is the form of a body. But only when it takes a body as I, the form of a body as I, can it thereby experience other forms, as he says in verse 4 of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, which I referred to a little while ago. So, Urupatri undam. So, grasping form, it comes into existence. Urupatri nikam, grasping form, it stands. What forms does it? First, always it's grasping the body as I. And also it grasps other things. Having grasped the body as I, it can then grasp other forms. So grasping form, it stands. So without grasping form, the ego cannot stand, is the implication. Urupatri undu mika ongum. Grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. That is, the more we attend to form, the more we attend to things other than ourselves, the more ego flourishes. Uluvittu urupatram. Leaving form, it grasps form. That is, the ego doesn't remain for a moment without grasping form. Bhagavan, probably you're aware of a certain type of worm. You don't get it in Europe, but in India you sometimes see it. It's a particular type of worm that has suction pads, I think probably they are, at the head and at the tail. And how it moves, it holds on to something with the front end, and then it lifts the whole back, curved up, and it lifts up the back end and brings it close to the front end. And then it lifts itself up again and moves forward. So it's got a particular movement. Bhagavan compared ego to that worm, because just like that worm will always be holding some form. It will let go of a previous form only after it's held a new form. So uru victu, uru patrum. As soon as it lets go of one form, it grasps another form. That is whenever, now we take the form of this body as I, but in dream, we are not we're not aware of this body. When we fall asleep, we leave this body, but in dream, we project another body and we take that as I. So, and when this body comes to an end, if ego isn't destroyed, we'll project another body. So this is how there's life after life after life. This is all because of this form grasping nature of ego. So it cannot leave, ego cannot stand without grasping form. When we are too tired to grasp form, what happens? We fall asleep. Ego subsides into sleep because it can't stand without grasping form. So what is the solution? How to get rid of this ego? We get rid of ego every day when we fall asleep, but that's not a permanent solution because it pops up again in, either in dream or in the next day in waking. So merely subsiding in sleep, that is manolaya. That's not a solution. We want to bring about manonasa, the state of in which ego doesn't rise. As Bhagavan says in verse 13 of Upadēśa Undiyār, there are two forms of complete cessation of mind. There's laya and nasa. What is dissolved in laya will rise again. What is dissolved in nasa will not rise again. That's the difference between them. So we want to bring about nasa. So how do we bring about nasa? The solution is ego stands only by grasping form. When it doesn't grasp form, it subsides into laya. Since the nature of ego is grasping, instead of trying to grasp other forms, let us try and grasp ourselves. That is what Bhagavan means in the final sentence, Tedinal otum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. Who is to seek and what is to be sought? It is ego is to seek itself, or to seek its own reality, the source from which it rose. In other words, to seek what actually am I? So ego needs to try to let go of, in order to investigate itself, it needs to let go of other things. So it needs to try to grasp itself. When ego tries to grasp itself, since it is a formless phantom, it dissolves back into its source. That is how the annihilation of ego is brought about. So if sought, it takes flight. That means if we try to investigate the more keenly we investigate this ego, the more it will subside and dissolve back into its source. And if we investigate ego so keenly that we thereby turn our back, so to speak, on all other things. In other words, if we turn a full 180 degrees away from phenomena back toward to face ourself alone, aham, Bhagavan says, facing I, that is facing inwards, to face ourself alone. If we turn the full 180 degrees to face ourself alone, we thereby cease to be aware of anything else. And so we are aware of ourselves as pure awareness. As soon as we are aware of ourselves as pure awareness, that in that infinite clarity of pure awareness, ego is swallowed forever, is destroyed forever. So as ego, we are trying to experience what we actually are. As soon as we experience what we actually are, ego is thereby destroyed. If you, supposing in the summer in Delhi, the sun is right above your head. Supposing you want to see the midday sun, what you have to do, you have to turn and face it, look at it. But what happens when you look at it? As soon as you see it, you're blinded by the brightness of that sun. So you never see anything again. Likewise, if ego sees what it actually is, it just has to see its real nature just for a moment, it is thereby annihilated. It is just like the eyes are blinded by seeing the midday tropical sun. The ego, as soon as it sees its real nature, it is thereby annihilated. So this is the solution given by Bhagavan. The nature of ego is to grasp things other than itself. In order to get rid of ego, we need to turn it back to face itself alone. So here he says, ego comes into existence grasping form. Then the question can arise, so does that mean the forms exist there and then ego comes and grasps them? No. Consider in sleep. I mean, in dream, as soon as we start dreaming, we grasp the form of a body as I, and we see through the five senses of that body, we see a world. But do we suppose that that dream body existed before we started dreaming? No, it's all a mental projection. So according to Bhagavan, all forms are just a projection of the mind. That he makes clear in verse 26 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. In verse 26, that is 25 and 26 are a pair of verses which need to be understood in conjunction, because each gives light to the other one. What he says in verse 26 is, Ahande undayin anatumundahum. If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Here, everything means all forms, all phenomena, all thoughts. They all come into existence only when ego comes into existence. If ego comes into existence, they automatically come into existence. That is, the nature of ego is to project and attach itself to a form and thereby project other forms. Ahande indrail indruanatum. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. That is, in the absence of ego in sleep, there are no forms, no phenomena, no thoughts, nothing. There's just that basic awareness I am, a fundamental awareness of our own existence. Therefore, Bhagavan concludes, Ahandeya yavamam. All these forms that we see, all these phenomena, they're nothing but a projection of ego, an expansion of ego. So ego itself is all these things. Then he concludes this verse by saying, Adalal yadu idu endrunadale ovadal yavamenor. That means, therefore, investigating what this is giving up everything. Why is investigating what this is giving up everything? Because, as he said in the previous verse, if we investigate what this is, it takes flight. If we investigate ego, it disappears. It dissolves back into its source. It subsides and dissolves back into its source. So if we investigate it, ego will dissolve back into its source, and ahande indrel indruanatum. If ego isn't, there's nothing else. Nothing else exists if ego doesn't exist. So in order to investigate, that is, by investigating what this ego is, we are thereby giving up everything. We're giving up not only ego, but everything else. This is why we need to have intense vairagya. We need to be free of desires and attachment in order to investigate ourselves keenly enough to know what we actually are. That's why Bhagavan said in Nāṉ Ār, he used the analogy of the pearl divers tying a stone to their waist. The stone in this case, the stone we need to tie to our waist is the stone of vairagya. So long as we've got strong Vishaya vasanas, they'll be dragging our mind outward. We won't be able to sink deep within. So we need to tie this stone of vairagya. How do we get that vairagya? Vairagya is vairagya and bhakti always go hand in hand. To the extent to which we love to know ourselves, to that extent will we be free of desires to experience other things. To the extent we have desire to know other things, our liking to know ourselves is lacking. So we need to cultivate that great love to know what we actually are. That love to know what we actually are is what is called sattvasana, the inclination just to be. It is also called swatma bhakti, the love for our own real nature. And Bhagavan has said that is parabhakti. That is the supreme bhakti. That is the culmination of all devotion, is the love just to be as we actually are. Because only when we have a love to be as we actually are we willing to give ourselves to God? Are we willing to surrender ourselves to God? So all these things, self-surrender, self-investigation, all are tied together and all are intimately connected to the nature of ego as revealed by Bhagavan. I'm aware I'm running. Is there time for me? I'd like, if possible, to deal with the next, with verses 27,
Sure,
28, 29,
sure,
and 30.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Then Bhagavan goes on to dealing more deeply with the actual practice. What he says in verse 27, this is a very important verse, that we all know the fundamental principle of Advaita is I am Brahman, you are that, Tattvamasi. But how, now, though that is the truth, that is always the truth, as Bhagavan says in verse 37 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, even to say duality during practice and non-duality after attainment, even that isn't true. Because who else is one but the 10th man, both when one is searching for the 10th man and when one finds oneself to be the 10th man. So the 10 men are always 10 men. We are always the 10th man, whether we know ourselves as such or not. So we are always Brahman. There's never a moment when we are not Brahman. But when we rise as ego, we are not aware of ourselves as Brahman, because instead of being aware, what is Brahman? Brahman is just I am. If we were aware of ourselves just as I am, that would be being aware of ourselves as Brahman. But we're not aware of ourselves just as I am. We're aware of ourselves as I am so-and-so, I am this person, I am Michael or whoever. So long as we rise as ego, we are not aware of ourselves as Brahman. So what Bhagavan says here is, Nāṇ Ār Nāmaduvai Uḻḷadu. That is, the state in which we exist without I rising, or without rising as I, that is the state in which we exist as that. So in order to be that, to be as it is, as he said in that first mangalam verse, in order to be in the heart as it is, we need to not rise as I. So the state in which we don't rise as I, that is the state in which we are that. So merely saying, I am that, I am that, I am Brahman, meditating on these Mahavakyas is of no use, because we need, who is the one who is meditating on Mahavakyas? It is only ego. So long as ego is there, we are not experiencing ourselves as Brahman. So we cannot experience ourselves as Brahman just by thinking I am Brahman. We need to stop rising as I. And so how to stop rising as I? That is what Bhagavan says in the next sentence. Without investigating the place where I rises, how to reach the annihilation of oneself in which I does not rise. That is the only way to bring about the non-rising of I, in other words, the total annihilation of ego, the annihilation of oneself. How to bring that about? Only by investigating the place where I rises. As I said earlier, Bhagavan uses the word place in a metaphorical sense. Obviously, it's not literally a place, because all places come into existence only when this I rises. Here he's using place in a metaphorical sense. From what does I rise? From what does I rise? This ego rises only from Satchit, only from our fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am. So investigating the place where I rises means investigating I am. Turning our attention away from all other things, back towards I am. That is investigating the place where I rises. And without doing so, how to bring about the annihilation of oneself? Here he's very clearly, he's very clearly saying there is no other way to bring about the annihilation of the ego except investigating where it rises. In other words, investigating what we actually are. He asked a similar rhetorical question in verse 22. What he asks in verse 22 is that is in verse 21. He ends verse 21 by saying, Uṇādal, becoming food is seeing. How to see ourselves or how to see God only by becoming food to what we actually are, to our real nature. So how to become food to our real nature? That's what he answers in verse 22 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. What he says is, except by turning the mind back within, completely immersing it in Pati. Pati means God or the Lord, who shines within that mind, giving light to the mind. How to fathom God by the mind? So in order to know Pati, the Lord, the God, who is that which is always shining in our heart as I, the pure awareness I am, how to know him? How can we know him except by turning back within? So it's only by turning back within and thereby immersing ourselves in him that we can know him. So in order to be swallowed by him, we need to turn back within and let the ego dissolve and immerse itself in him. So here also he's emphasizing it's only by turning within and immersing ourselves in that pure awareness I am that we can know God as he really is. In other words, we can know our real nature. So in both these verse 22 and 27, he's asking a rhetorical question. Both these rhetorical questions clearly imply only by investigating ourselves can we bring about the annihilation of ego and thereby know what we actually are, thereby be aware of ourselves as I am that, as Brahman, in other words. So he says in the second sentence, without investigating the place where I rises, how to reach the annihilation of oneself in which I does not rise. And then in the last sentence, he says, without reaching, that implies without reaching that, without attaining that annihilation of ourself, say, how to stand in the state of oneself in which oneself is that. So in order to experience ourselves as Brahman, we need to be abide in our own state of by not rising as ego. And in order not to rise as ego, we need to bring about the annihilation of we need to bring about the annihilation of ourselves by investigating the place from which we rise. Then in verse 28, he continues the same subject. I mean, investigating the ego. That is what he says in verse 28 is, like sinking, wanting to see something that has fallen in water, sinking within, retaining speech and breath by a kundamati, that is a sharpened mind, it's necessary to know the place where the rising ego rises. He's expressed it very beautifully. Erumba mahande erumidate. That is the place where the rising ego rises, or the rising place of a rising ego. Rising place means the place from which it rises, and rising ego is that which rises. So what we need to know is the rising place of the rising ego. That is the place from which ego rises. In other words, the pure awareness I am from which ego has risen. So how to know that? By a kundamati. Kundamati means a sharply focused, or a very sharp mind, a very keen mind. We need to, in other words, we need to turn within with a very keen intellect, and by that sharp mind that turns within to know the place from which I rises, we thereby restrain speech and breath. Some people mistake this, but Bhagavan is saying, oh, it's necessary to control speech and breath in order to do this. No, it's not necessary. That is, restraining speech and breath is a byproduct. If you turn your attention within very keenly, automatically the speech and breath will be restrained. That is, whenever the mind is keenly focused on something, the breathing stops. Supposing you're suddenly told some very shocking news, it took my breath away. That means we're so shocked, momentarily the breath it comes to a standstill. When it happens, even with external things, sometimes we are breathless, our breath is taken away by things. When we turn our attention within, our breath is literally taken away. That we attend to ourselves so keenly, but breathing stops. In the case of Bhagavan, when that fear of death came to him, he turned his attention within so keenly that not only his breathing stopped, even the whole metabolic system stopped, his breathing stopped, his heartbeat stopped, everything. For 20 minutes, his body was literally lying there lifeless. But because there was a divine purpose for that body had been brought to serve as the vehicle for the supreme Jnana Guru. After 20 minutes, life came back to that body. So Bhagavan lived for another, that body lived for another 54 years to be a vehicle for Bhagavan, the supreme Jnana Guru, who came to save us by revealing Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu and other such teachings in order to bring us back to the source from which we have risen. So we don't have if we are trying to control our breath, our attention is on our breath. and not on ourselves. What we are trying to know is to know the place from which we rise. In other words, the source from which we rise, our own real nature. So we need to turn our attention back within to know, who am I? From where did this spurious I, ego, arise? By turning our attention back within, we are thereby automatically restraining the speech and breath. And he gives the analogy like sinking. If something has fallen into the water, you need to go deep into the water in order to retrieve it. This is similar to the analogy he gives in Nāṉ Ār, the pearl diver. The pearl diver needs to sink deep into the ocean in order to get the pearls. And in order to sink deep into the ocean, he needs to tie that stone on his waist. That is the stone of vairagya, or bhakti and vairagya, we can take it. So with this bhakti and vairagya, we need to sink deep within ourselves, investigating with a keen mind, where does this I rise? So Bhagavan describes the practice of self-investigation very beautifully here. And likewise in verse 29 he does. In verse 29, he says, Nāṉ Ār, without saying I by mouth, Uڵḷadu, by the inward sinking mind, Nāṉ Undiyār, investigating with an inward sinking mind, where does it rise as I, or where do we rise as I? Investigating with an inward sinking mind, where does one rise as I? That alone is jnana. Jnana means the path of knowledge. So what is the path of knowledge? It is just turning the mind within so keenly and keenly investigating the place from which I rise it, and thereby the mind sinks within. That is the path of knowledge. The path of knowledge is what Bhagavan otherwise calls vichara, the self-investigation. But then he says, Andri idu Nāṉ Ār endru unnal tunayam Atma-vichara. Besides this, or instead of this, thinking I am not this, I am that, is an aid. But vichara, is it inquiry? No, the implication, I mean, it's a rhetorical question. The obvious answer to that rhetorical question, the answer that is implied by the rhetorical question is no, it is not inquiry. Merely that we can study it, we need to grasp the basic principles of direction. We need to understand that we are not this body or mind or intellect or will. We are not any of these five sheaves. We are only that aware. We are nothing but awareness. We need to understand all these things. But merely thinking, I am not this, I am that, we're still floating on the surface of the mind. Bhagavan says, in order to contemplate that, in order to contemplate that sat vastu, that uḷḷadu, we need to be in the heart as it is. In order to be in the heart as it is means we have to be free of thoughts. But so merely thinking I am this, I am not this body, I am that. Who is thinking I am not this body? It is ego. Who is thinking I am that? It is ego. So long as we're thinking, we are sustaining ego. We need to give up all thinking. We need to turn our attention back within to find out where this first thought I rises. Where does it rise? It rises only from the pure awareness I am. So investigating with an inward sinking mind, that fundamental awareness I am, that alone is vichara. That alone is the path of knowledge. So that's what he's emphasizing here. Because before Bhagavan, many people thought that all you need to do, you need to study the scriptures, you need to contemplate on the fact that we're not this body, and go through all the arguments why we are not the body, why we're not the mind, why we're not any of these five sheaves, and then contemplate on I am Brahman, and why am I Brahman, not anything else. We need to be thinking about all these things until it becomes a very strong conviction. A mere conviction is not sufficient. We can understand it clearly, but that is not sufficient. We still experience, who is it who understands all this Vedanta? I do. That I that understands Vedanta is only ego. True understanding of Vedanta comes only when that ego is eradicated. In the final verse of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu Anubandham, Bhagavan translated, I think this was a verse of Shankara or from somewhere, Bhagavan translated this. What he says, it summarizes it all. Akila Vedanta Siddhanta Sarate Aham Unmayaha Ureban. I will truly say what is the essence of the final conclusion of all Vedanta. What is that? Aham Setu, I dying, Aham Adu Ahi, I becoming that. If I dies and becomes that, that is, that means if ego dies and if one remains as that, though it says if becoming, it actually means if one remains, if one abides as that. Arivuruvam aham ade michamari. Only that what will remain is only that I, which is awareness. So that is the essence of all Vedanta. So it's only when I dies that we can achieve that essence of Vedanta. So long as there's an ego meditating, I am not this body, I am that Brahman, we cannot experience the import of Vedanta. What is the import of Vedanta? Vedantate Vera Vilangam Veda Porala Aruṇācala. Bhagavan prays in Akṣaramaṇamālai. Graciously give me the Vedantate Vera Vilangam Veda Poral, the import, the substance of the Vedas. What is the Veda Poral? That is the Satvastu, the Ulla which shines without a second in Vedanta. So Vedanta without another, there's no other, because it's ekkameva advitam, it's one only without another. So long as there's an ego thinking, I am not this body, I am that Brahman, we cannot experience ourselves as Brahman. In order to experience ourselves as Brahman, we need to, it's only in the state where I doesn't rise, but it's the state where we experience ourselves as that, as he says in verse 27. So all these are closely interconnected. Then I'll conclude, though I would like to talk about other verses, I think I've been talking long enough. I'll conclude with verse 30. What Bhagavan says in verse 30 is, oh, wait a second, I just want to say one more thing about verse 29, because in the Kaliveṇbā version, he says, Kaliveṇbā version of verse 29, there's a very important extension there. But that is the words he adds before the verse in the Kaliveṇbā version is Pinnam pol tindu udalam. That means discarding the body like a corpse. What does he mean when he says discarding the body like a corpse? When this body dies, what will be our relationship with it? We will be totally unaware of it. But that is our connection with this body will be severed. So leaving the body like a corpse means completely separating ourselves from the body. How can we separate ourselves from the body? By not attending to it. So that emphasizes the intensity with which we need to turn our attention within to investigate the place from which we rise. So long as there's even a lingering awareness of this body, we haven't turned within keenly enough. So we need to investigate ever more keenly until this awareness of the body and of all phenomena completely recedes into the background. That is when we become established in our own real state of Brahman, and in the state of we are that. What Bhagavan says in verse 30 is, Nāna ena manum ulnad. Sorry, Nāna ena manum ulnadi ullum nanave. When the mind inwardly investigating, who am I? Ulam nanave. As soon as the mind reaches the heart, inwardly investigating, who am I? Nanam abam tale nanamura. The he who is I, that means ego, tale nanamura, it will attain head shame. It's literally what it means. It means the head will bow down in shame. That's an idiomatic way of saying this ego will die. It will die in shame, because when the mind finally reaches the heart, and by investigating who am I, when we reach the heart, that's when we see what we actually are, this ego will be put to shame. Why will it be put to shame? Because there's no such thing at all. As he says in verse 17 of Upadēśa Undiyār, when we investigate the form of the mind without negligence or without forgetfulness, there's no such thing as mind at all. There's no such thing as ego at all. So this ego will be put to shame. When we see what we actually are, this imposter ego will be put to shame. It will die in shame, is the implication. So when this ego dies in shame as a result of our reaching the heart by investigating who am I, what will happen then? One thing appears spontaneously as I am I. That is Nāṉ Ār tondrum ondru tānaha. That is, one thing appears spontaneously as I am I. Nān is often mistranslated as I, but that is not the meaning. Nān in Tamil means I am I, just like Nāṉ Ār or Nāṇ means who am I, but I am is understood there. So Nān means I am I. Till now, we've been experiencing ourselves as I am this body, I am this. But when this ego dies, what will shine forth clearly then, that one thing that will shine forth clearly then is the clear awareness, I am I. That is, I am nothing other than myself. The only thing that I can identify myself with is with myself. I am nothing other than myself, is the implication. Then here Bhagavan says it appears, but then in the next sentence he says, though it appears, tondrinum nanandru, though it appears, it is not I. That means the I that appears and disappears is only ego. But why does he say it appears here? But the reality appears, but reality is always there. That is, what is lying on the ground is always a snake, always a rope. But so long as you mistake it to be a snake, you don't see the rope as it is. When you look at it very carefully to see what is this snake, is it actually a snake or something else? When you look at it very carefully, you say, oh, it's just a rope. As soon as you see it's just a rope, you know there never was a snake there. That is, the snake disappears. But it seems to be a new revelation, because previously you're seeing exactly the same thing, but previously you were seeing it as a rope, as a snake. When you see it as it is, but it's just a rope, that it seems to be a new appearance, but it's not actually a new appearance, because it's what we are seeing all along is only I am. Now we mistake I am to be I am this body. So though it appears, it is not ego. Adu pundra porul pundrum adu. That is the purna vastu, the whole reality. Porul pundrum adu, tanam porul. It is the porul here means vastu. It is the paripurna vastu. It is the vastu which is oneself. Tanam porul. So though it appears, it's not it is the paripurna vastu. It is the vastu which is ourself. The vastu which he referred to in verse 7, saying that it is that which shines without appearing and disappearing as the base for the appearing and disappearing of the mind and world. So that is the reality. So when we turn within, investigating who am I doesn't mean asking the question, who am I? Bhagavan never said to ask who am I. He said investigate who am I. In Nāṉ Ār, in paragraph 6, some people have, because people have translated the verb vichari as inquire, some people interpret it to mean asking questions. Bhagavan uses the verb vichari in the sense of investigate. It's not a matter of asking who am I, but of investigating who am I. We need to look at ourselves very keenly to see what am I, who am I, or what am I, or what is the place from which I rise. All amount to the same thing. I mean, it's just different ways of expressing the same thing. We need to look at ourselves very keenly. And only when we look at ourselves very keenly will we reach the heart and remain as we are. At that moment, ego will be annihilated. And what will remain shining is only that pure awareness, I am I. That is, I am, this will be eradicated, and I am I alone will remain shining. I've gone through these verses in somewhat in detail. So when we go through in detail, it may superficially seem to be a bit complicated. But actually, if we think of it deeply, what Bhagavan is saying in all these verses, he's just saying the same thing in different ways. What the essence of all of this is extremely simple. The essence is what he explains in verse 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu, but the nature of ego is to grasp form. If this form-grasping ego tries to grasp itself, it will subside and disappear. In other words, so long as our attention is directed outwards towards things other than ourselves, we seem to be ego. When we turn our attention back within, if we look within keenly enough to see what we actually are, we will see there's no such thing as ego at all. So the way to bring about the dissolution of ego, the way to bring about the subsidence of ego is just look at it. The more you look at ego, the more it subsides. And when you look at it carefully enough, you see there's no such thing as ego at all. There's only pure awareness. Just like if you look at the snake very carefully, you see it's only a rope.